For quite a while now, I've suspected that among the absolute ruling elite, I would say they're the aristocracy, the actual aristocracy, not the people like Bill Gates and Elon Musk and these public figures who are not at the top, but the people who are really at the top, the actual aristocracy, who have family histories that go back thousands of years, some of them, and have oligarchical roots that go back historically. You could trace it back 2,000-3,000 years in some cases. And that in this group, you have had two factions. One you could identify with leading up to the time of the, just before the Italian Renaissance, you had the Guelphs and Ghibellines, for instance. And the Guelphs were identified as the bankers, the wealthy oligarchy with ties to the Pope, and not because they were particularly devout Christians, but because there was tremendous prestige and wealth and power in being bankers to the Pope and being bankers in general and operating through profiting from usury, slavery, the Venetian Empire, right? Northern Italian banking. And then on the other side would be the Ghibellines, who were identified with the German city builders, the Hohenstaufens, going back to a tradition that you could say was amounted to a real renaissance with Charlemagne, spreading literacy, innovating in building technologies, and then out of this came, and the Holy Roman Empire and the Holy Roman Emperor. The Ghibellines were loyal to the Holy Roman Emperor. So you had the Guelphs on taking the side of the Pope, and the Ghibellines taking the side of the Holy Roman Emperor. Going back further, you could argue that this schism is perhaps analogous to the Plato versus Aristotle. Plato being a proponent of creative reason and uplift, and Aristotle being a favorite voice in the philosophical vein of the oligarchy, as he was very much in defense of slavery. And then going back further, you could say, you could talk about Prometheus versus Zeus representing the oligarchy, and Prometheus representing perhaps a visionary, someone who wanted to unlock the secrets of the universe to use for the general welfare and advancement. And all of this being said, it seems as though, and I've suspected this, that there has been going along two tracks, bitterly opposed, hostile camps, factions within the ruling oligarchy, one being very much on the side of speculation, oppression, imperialism, slavery of all kinds, and associated with this would also, up until today, you could talk about the World Economic Forum and this bizarre vision of humanity as nothing more than biological machines, hackable animals. This is echoed in the Venetian tradition, the Venetian oligarchical tradition, which held that there was no such thing as a human soul. People who only had the illusion that they were capable of creative reason. And then on the other side, you had in Florence, which would be the epitome of the other faction, the progressive development faction, which held that we were made in the image of God, imago Dei, for instance. So, 2 tracks, bitterly opposed, and I'd been trying to uncover evidence of this. And recently, with Trump's reelection, you see this sea change in U.S. policy as relates to Ukraine. I have to say I was very wrong. I thought that Trump would come in and just continue to do what Biden had been doing, regardless of what his rhetoric had been, which had been rather simple-minded, I thought, and two-dimensional on this. So I just anticipated the U.S. would continue to send more money and support to Ukraine, completely heedless of what that might lead to. So when Trump came in and then shut off the funds and denounced Zelensky and denigrated the way the whole thing had been going, and demanding the money back, I had to think again, because I had, of course, very mixed, hesitant, skeptical view of Trump, especially with regard to his position on Israel, which I can't square with anything having to do with the Ghibelline faction, the Platonic, Socratic faction, the Hohenstaufen, the Republic, the 1776 spirit, echoing the values and virtues of the Renaissance, all this whole Ghibelline outlook. I couldn't square him with that because of Israel, and I still can't. But his views on the position he's taken, the very strong position, unequivocal position on Ukraine, has made me consider that this other faction is still alive. You could argue that the American Revolution was gradually snuffed out through subterfuge and sabotage by pro-British traitors and by British subversion. Certainly, you go back to the Italian Renaissance, you can see how it was attacked by Venetian bankers, and there was conflict between Florence and Venice. You could point to Dante Alighieri, who was, although he was a white Guelph, being a white Guelph, favored accommodating and understanding and working with, having a shared vision with the Holy Roman Emperor. So he was at war with the worst, the dark banking occult forces of Europe's aristocracy, and did not prevail in the end, sadly. So, given the sad history of defeats on the side of the Ghibellines, you might presume that this tradition, this outlook, this epistemology had been completely snuffed out. But then one sees Trump going in a different direction from the dark aristocracy in Europe. And you see that the Europeans are going to continue. You see the UK and France still intent on sending troops and keeping this thing going, just completely suicidal. But given the underlying anti-human attitude and outlook of these people, you can understand it's not a war that they, in any realistic way, think they can win. They just would like to see a lot of things smashed up. They'd like to see a lot of people die. They'd like to see millions of people die. Depopulation is essential to their outlook. So it's clear now that, as people used to think the Europeans are just tag-alongs, junior partners of the United States, it's clear that now Trump has exposed that this is not the case, and I've never believed this was the case. I believe the preponderance of power, the overwhelming, the source of national policy for the United States and economic policy and foreign policy has been determined increasingly over the years by the very powerful dark aristocracy that has a financial center in Geneva and uses the British to maintain sort of administrative control through think tanks and through Tavistock. So that led me, and then this article, The Campaigner, from The Campaigner, I don't even know if this publication still exists, Journal of the National Caucus of Labor Committee, it's LaRouche. And so I would just say that going into this, and he's talking about the same thing, that there are these two factions. I think I have to I just needed to let some more of this load. I had turned on airplane mode. That there could indeed be, the Ghibelline faction has survived, but according to this article by LaRouche, it has survived, but it has been somehow severed from the foundational knowledge that underlies this proposition, this very important proposition that we are made in the image of God, that we have creative reason, and that the most evil thing you can do is to try to stunt or thwart that, and the most productive, most satisfying thing a person can do is to celebrate that and to work toward its realization, which is never finished, but which continues. So that's basically it. And then I think, my thesis would be at this point that we talk about wanting to expose the elite and their occult practices and the dark things that they do, which are indeed horrific, almost beyond belief. But I would say, and secret societies and so forth, but I would say that an even more suppressed area of knowledge, beyond the usual controversial or so-called conspiracy theory, although I really hate that term, beyond, deeper, more hidden, more cordoned off from our consideration, is the survival of this other faction. I've often wondered, at the very top, among the rulers of the planet, are there some good ones? And who are they? What are they doing? What are they about? So this article is very exciting for me to discover and to entertain the possibility that indeed I was correct, and that perhaps the Ghibelline faction has survived, but in a kind of diminished state, but that it's reasserting itself. And how do we then connect with those deeper sources of knowledge that once informed the movement that we associate with Nicholas of Cusa or Plato or Da Vinci or Ben Franklin, or much later John F. Kennedy, for instance. So that's a long introduction, but this is a big topic, and this might take me a number of videos, but I think it's worth it. And I think as everybody is trying to suss out whom they can trust, can we trust Musk? Can we trust Trump? You should never trust anyone, That's not what this is about. It's about developing from the inside out, being critical. It involves being co-creators. It involves informing oneself, and it involves something more than simply the kind of lazy confirmation bias by which most people navigate their positions in social media. So here's explaining the cover here of the Campaigner. Let me just read this. The cover features Plato and Aristotle shown in detail from Raphael's famous School of Athens. Following convention based on Aristotelian myth, Raphael portrayed the two philosophers in friendly discourse, the aging Plato on the left pointing to the heavens to illustrate his stress on the role of the mind, and the younger Aristotle pointing to earth to symbolize his preoccupation with solid reality. While the Campaigner rips apart this myth to detail the actual bitter battle between the Platonic and Aristotelian elites that continue to this day, it is by no means to be presumed that Raphael was unaware of the dichotomy between the two tendencies. Significantly, Raphael, pupil of the great Neoplatonic humanist Leonardo da Vinci, has given his Plato the features of his master Leonardo. This is great stuff. God, there's so much in this issue that is I'm going to get into. We should just excavate it. I mean, it's incredible. Look at this. But I'm going to go directly now to this article. Here we have it. The Secrets Known Only to the Inner Elites by Lyndon LaRouche, Jr. Through 3 millennia of recorded history to date, centered around the Mediterranean, the civilized world has been run by 2 bitterly opposed elites, the one associated with the faction of Socrates and Plato, the other with the faction of Aristotle. During these thousands of years, until the developments of approximately 1784 to 1818 in Europe, both factions' inner elites maintained in some fashion an unbroken continuity of organization and knowledge through all of the political catastrophes which afflicted each of them in various times and locales. The cleverest way, psychologically, in which to hide a secret is to divert the investigator down a tiring trail toward a false dichotomy. His own efforts convince him either that he has found a secret through great energy and cleverness on his own part, or, if the secret he seeks appears still but to barely elude his grasp, he values all the more his continued course of misdirection. That is the lesson which can be learned from Edgar Allan Poe's fictional case of the Purloined Letter. Exemplary of the follies into which presumably educated and informed people are misled in the pursuit of the snipe are the doctrines of the International Jewish Conspiracy and the recently more popular International Communist Conspiracy. Okay, take note again, this is from 1978, which is my favorite period to study. From like 78 through like 86. It's just incredible what you can unearth and the kinds of inferences you can draw from studying this time as it relates to what's happening today. Hence, we have retro research, right? Yeah, I believe in this method. I believe in this, what we're doing here. So going on. During the 20th century, more people have been turned into dupes along these 2 false trail pursuits than any competing obsessions. The effect of that sort of misdirected search for the ultimate global master conspiracy is principally twofold. The dupes themselves are misled away from the secrets being hidden in this manner. Secondly, the discredit which is directed to fall upon the lured, turns most others foolishly away from all searches for the secrets of those inner elites, which have in fact run the world's affairs during approximately 3,000 years of known history. To illustrate the corollary aspect of the problem, during a meeting between this writer and a leading political figure of Italy, which occurred during early 1976, the latter asked, "Why is it that Ugo La Malfa always comes out on top?" The context of this question was the period of initial efforts to replace the La Malfa-preferred Moro government with an Andreotti government. In the course of most of the post-war political crises in Italy, tiny, now aging Ugo La Malfa, spokesman for the relatively tiny Republican Party of Italy, appeared to play the tunes to which Italy subsequently danced. The answer to that particular question is essentially, Ugo La Malfa has been a key Italian agent of influence for British intelligence services all of his adult life. So this seems a bit maybe arcane here, but I think we need to look at the world stage today, and we can probably easily point to leaders who don't appear to stay where they are year after year because they're so brilliant and visionary and talented. It's obviously because there's something else going on, that they've been placed there by a kind of global deep state. And so if you go back to this period, late 70s, you see this essentially in a microcosm of this in Italy, where they try out a lot of these things. So, going on. This is not to suggest that British intelligence services operatives individually are supermen. In general, such agents, including leading operatives, are poor lot, short attention spans, scatterbrained, without moral mooring worth mention, easily provoked into loss of personal self-control. The majority, downright louts, bores. So, Ugo La Malfa himself. It is not British intelligence services viewed in the terms of the presumably informed layman, in the terms the presumably informed layman ordinarily thinks of an intelligence service, which are relevant to the indicated problems of La Malfa, although British networks do have inclusively the sort of characteristics the misinformed layman would expect. More or less, it is not such incidentals which would account for La Malfa's past successes. The relevant key point can be abstracted fairly thus. Since the English traitors Robert Cecil and Francis Bacon around the onset of the 17th century, and later, more notably, from the 1660 Stuart Restoration to the present day, within and behind British intelligence, regular and irregular services, there is an inner circle representing the ranks of the black Guelph families of all Europe, an oligarchy gathered round the privileges and powers of the British and Dutch monarchies. Attached to and overlapping these oligarchical families, there is a special collectivity traditionally centered notably in Oxford, Cambridge, and Sussex universities, an inner intelligentsia of that faction, which studies the classics, thereby to gain the knowledge through which the forces associated with the British monarchy may rule the world. Through 3 millennia of recorded history to date, centered around the Mediterranean. So I'm thinking, I just was flashing on Pan-Arabism, it was a complete creation of this clique we just described, entirely a fabrication of this group. Through 3 millennia of recorded history to date, centered around the Mediterranean, the civilized world has been run by 2 bitterly opposed elites, the one associated with the faction of Socrates and Plato, the other with the faction of Aristotle. During these thousands of years until the development of approximately 1784 to 1818 in Europe, both factions, inner elites, maintained in some fashion an unbroken continuity of organization and knowledge through all the political catastrophes which afflicted each of them in various times and locales. I know I'm rereading this, I'm rehashing, there's a lot of repetition. I just want to really emphasize this fundamental epistemological dichotomy and reinforce it over and over until people start to sort of take off on their own, to sort of suss out and sort of looking at history through this understanding. You can see evidence of these factions. You can see, and maybe you can even look at the world of today and be able to see traces of each. It was the elite associated with the Platonic or Neoplatonic faction which organized the American Revolution and established the United States as a democratic constitutional republic. During the early 18th century, in circumstances associated with Marlborough's campaign and the Mississippi and South Sea bubbles plots, the continuity of the Platonic faction was first administered a broad, temporary defeat with some lasting effects, and was shattered later as a world force through the events of 1784 to 1818. In the aftermath of the 1815 Treaty of Vienna, the shattering of the power of the Platonic elite in Europe meant, in large measure, both a scattering of the main forces of that faction and an associated increasing loss of the secret knowledge through which the Platonic inner elite had formally developed and exercised its factional power. From that time to the present period, the inner circle of the Aristotelian, or more exactly Neo-Aristotelian faction, have been hegemonic increasingly in ordering world affairs. Although humanist, Platonic, factions have continued in existence and are represented among political and related elites today, the Platonic elite has lost its connection to the body of knowledge upon which its former power depended. The person who posed the question cited, Ugalamalfa question, is exemplary of this problem. He is not only a Christian humanist and a member of the ruling political elite, but a man of unusual personal character as well as political skills and power. Yet, with the considerable knowledge available to him, he did not know the answer to the question. Any member of the Platonic elite in command of the secret knowledge of that tradition would have known the answer immediately. So we see that even back in 1978, traces evidence of this conflict and of the existence, the persisting, the ongoing, the persistence of that Ghibelline spirit and the spirit of the Renaissance and the American Revolution. Although it's persisted, it's been increasingly obscured in a very devious way that is largely invisible to most people. The principal function of this report is to summarily but systematically identify the secret knowledge of the Platonic inner elite. That includes the Platonic's knowledge of the secrets of the enemy, Aristotelian elite. Although the object of this writer and his associates is to end the ages-long division between elites and the credulous, myth-ridden masses, this cannot be accomplished usefully by bringing the elites down to the ignorance of the masses. The masses must be brought up out of mythology's grip to attain the qualities of the Platonic elite. That accomplishment is impossible without the leading role of a reconstituted Platonic elite. Education is impossible without the educators. Such a transformation of the mass of plebeians is the work of years, even under favorable circumstances. At the moment of this writing, 1978, it would be criminal folly to propose to wait years before bringing the Platonic faction back into a leading position in the government of society. If the Neo-Aristotelian faction prevails through the present period of crises, it is more than conceivable that the human race might not survive, or, at best, that the new beginnings of civilization would have to be assembled from the shards of general thermonuclear war. The Platonic elite in the fullness of its knowledge must be reconstituted now. That cannot occur unless the secret knowledge of that faction is reestablished with aid of reference to classical knowledge resurrected in appropriately modern terms of reference. That indispensable articulation is the function of this report. Let me see how long. I think what I'll do, I know maybe it's cruel to some, others might think this is a bit long as it stands. I'll read a few more minutes, although that's a good place for a break. The conspirators. Yes, Adelaide, the world has been run by conspiratorial elites employing secret knowledge. In its lesser aspects, that conspiracy has subsumed features which coincide at first impression with what you might imagine a conspiracy to be. However, if you pursue the investigation from the standpoint of your usual misguided perceptions of a global conspiracy, quote unquote, you will only mislead yourself into another pathetic concoction of mixed facts, half-truths, and fantasies, like the concoctions associated with the international Jewish conspiracy or international communist conspiracy. Global conspiracies which function succeed by establishing controlled environments around the minds of the credulous masses of the world. I love that. I'm going to read that again. Global conspiracies which function succeed by establishing, quote-unquote, controlled environments around the minds of the credulous masses of the world. You know, the last few videos I've made on Tavistock, I talk about the empire of the mind. And I think this is a direct allusion to the same thing, Tavistock being the technique that's used, and the modus operandi. Such a controlled environment is summed up efficiently by stating that the credulous masses are ruled by mythologies, and that the elites rule such masses by creating, shaping, and manipulating the mythologies. The methods employed by Joseph Goebbels and carried further by British intelligence networks for creating and manipulating the mythologies of credulous masses through control of all, or at least key portions of the press, radio, and television are the center of modern techniques to this effect. So Tavistock, and now of course it's pretty much monolithic. It's control everything, right? Outside and above the foolish folk who rely upon the Washington Post, New York Times, London Times, or the popular women's magazines, and so on and so forth, there is indeed a governing elite. This elite does possess secret knowledge. The first aspect of this special knowledge, which makes it efficiently secret, is that the elite not only know that the mythologies are mythologies, but also know that they themselves create and use those mythologies to manipulate the credulous masses. Beyond that, And we should reflect there on how we see this today on Facebook, with all of the Christians, the Christianity, and these persisting myths that are used, and how otherwise very intelligent people fall into this miasma of like the book of Revelations and what's predicted and who's the Antichrist and all of this absolute rot, unwittingly falling into the trap that they claim to be exposing. That's the genius of mythology, and that points to a very interesting vulnerability, the human mind, as relates to the imagination, the power of imagination, which can be used for good or for ill. Beyond that first broad level of division between the knowledgeable and the credulous, the secret knowledge is distinguished by the division of elites into two irreconcilable factions. Beyond the sheep pens of the believers in mythologies, there exist two fundamentally opposed views of what to do with the world, of what direction to adopt in steering the historical movement of the human species. One elite, the humanists, the Platonic or Neoplatonic faction, is dedicated to steering the course of history away from rule through mythologies. The other, the Aristotelians and their heirs, is committed to strengthening the rule by mythology for the purpose of establishing a permanent feudal-like utopia of obedient, simple-minded folk ruled by a tenured neo-Aristotelian oligarchy. We see that now with the WEF. We see a kind of false scientism, which is a kind of mythology, where, they claim with no real proof that this all there is to a human being is that which is hackable, mechanistic, and without proof, and in a very hostile way, assiduously ignoring any scientific voice that has anything to say to the contrary. They continue to push a kind of a mythology that masquerades as something else. The secret knowledge is, at first distinction, as secret as the purloined letter of the Poe tale. Once the mythologies are known to be mythologies, the primitive aspect of truth actually lies factually in plain sight. Once mythology is cast aside, the development of real knowledge out of such primitive truth, the development properly termed scientific progress, begins. In the case of Lamalfa, the point to be made is this: Ugo Lamalfa, like Cuccia of Mediobanca, Riccardo Lombardi of the Socialist Party of Italy, and Amendola and Napolitano of the leadership of the Communist Party of Italy, began his career as a British intelligence services agent under the tutelage of the same evil Benedetto Croce who mentally crippled Antonio Gramsci and many others. Together with the British intelligence services Italian mafia and the British allied black nobility of Italy, the networks radiating from Croce's original base at Naples University are among the principal forces that presently govern Italy from within for London. In the end, it is the black Guelph oligarchy of Italy, which is the local branch of the real rulers. The mafia, together with such persons as Lamalfa, Lombardi, and Amendola, are merely the expendable mercenaries. So I think that's where I'll stop. Although I'd love to go on. There's a lot to cover, but there's a lot to digest. And I don't want this to be at all tedious. And I want to keep people coming back for this because I think this is the most important thing. I believe that more secret and more suppressed than the dark practices of the occult masters would be the existence of an alternative.